Now, let me ask you, how many of you watch or listen to BBC in any form or shape? Virtually everybody. So, I'm sure you'll be glad to listen to BBC itself at this event. What we've done is to invite Stephen Baily, who is coordinating operations and developments of the BBC broadcast transmission services. He's also, in the previous life, had been the head of research at BBC. BBC is a very interesting organization, and like you've just demonstrated, has touched our lives. So let's listen to BBC. It's up to you. Now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to everybody for the chance to be here today and to speak to you. It's a great privilege. I think if we could move to the next slide, or can I do that? Okay. Actually, I think Ilham and Carleen have already done quite a lot of my job for me in talking about a lot of the issues. So I'm going to talk briefly about how the European broadcasting environment was before the introduction of digital and the launch of DTT. I'm then going to talk about how DSO worked in Europe. I will talk a little bit about what DTV is like in Europe following DSO, and then draw just some quick conclusions. I think it's probably important to say that Europe is a very diverse continent. It has around about 50 countries altogether. Some of them are very large. So the population of Germany is about 80 million people, and some of them are very small, so of the order of perhaps a million people or two. Because of that, the way that the broadcasting market in each of those countries has developed is very different. But prior to the start of digital TV, they all had very well developed analog terrestrial TV networks. Typically a mixture of publicly funded and commercial channels. So the UK had 4 such channels, 2 of each, for many, many years. In fact, just before digital broadcasting started, a 5th channel, which was called Channel 5, launched in the UK, but there were 4 channels with what we would refer to as universal service provision. And by that we mean that something in the very high 90% of the households in the country were covered by analog TV. So that sets quite a high bar for what digital TV had to achieve. Also, both, certainly in the UK, but I think this is true in other countries as well, both publicly funded and commercial channels were required to serve all audiences with a wide variety of programs. A typical European network would have a core of high-power main transmitting stations, so the UK has around about 50 of those. Those would serve the major centres of population and wide geographical areas, and then those were supplemented by a large number of relay stations, transmitting, generally speaking, at quite low powers, and serving smaller communities and providing geographical infill. So in the UK, we have around about 1,100 of such smaller transmitting stations. In order to do that, you have full occupancy of the UHF band. Can we? Oh, that's fine. Yeah. So we have full occupancy of the UHF band. So that's from channel 21 to 68 inclusive, and that's all in terms of terrestrial. Many countries also had quite well developed cable and satellite services. The variation in take-up was really quite wide. So in some countries you had sort of very much majority cable penetration. In other countries it was quite low. So it's a very, very diverse picture coming into the advent of digital TV. So typically, DTT launched in what we refer to as interleaved spectrum. So if you can make out in the graphic here, which is not particularly clear, there are analog services, which are the ones in the spectrum that appear as that sort of spiky signature. And so there are 4 of them at full power, and one of them at a slightly reduced power, which was the 5th channel that I mentioned. And then interleaved between those in the spectrum, you have the new digital broadcasts. Again, 3 of them at quite high powers, and then 3 of them at slightly reduced powers. And that was very typical in the early introduction of digital TV, that the new digital services would be introduced in that way. They were introduced at main stations and relay stations only, and larger relay stations only, because there simply wasn't enough spectrum to introduce them anywhere else. And the transmitting powers were very much limited by the need to avoid interference into the existing analog TV. We used the same receiving aerial group where possible. So that's if you had analog services for example, in the high UHF band, then you would want the digital services to be there as well, so that it would work for people's domestic aerials, and the same for the lower UHF band. And so you found a lot of digital signals were typically adjacent in the adjacent UHF channel to the analog channel. So this again is a very typical pattern across Europe. And in terms of timing, sort of pioneer countries like the UK and Sweden were launching with this sort of service in the late 1990s. Most countries then followed in the early 2000s, and only a very few countries in Europe were actually launching digital TV after about 2010. So we then move on to the next phase, as Ilham said, the next thing is, having launched your initial DTT services, how do you then move to digital switchover? And across Europe, there was really a set of more or less common aims. To replicate analog coverage, so to provide that universal coverage, to deliver a much increased choice of TV channels, and to release spectrum for use in the mobile industry. In terms of timing, there were some pioneer countries who were typically those with the highest use of cable TV. Those countries, generally speaking, were in the sort of mid to late 2000s, but the majority of countries between about 2010 and 2013 went entirely over to digital terrestrial TV. There are, as I think Ilham mentioned, there are very few countries now in Europe that do have some remaining analog TV, but it's not their primary service, generally speaking. So in terms of the process, again, Ilham mentioned the need for frequency planning as absolutely key to this. And in Europe, that was known as the Geneva Plan, and it was agreed in 2006, and it was essentially a whole Europe plan for the deployment of digital TV. Months of preparatory work, weeks of actual sort of detailed planning conference to agree those new frequencies. All broadcasters then had a complex infrastructure build. The principle really was to reuse infrastructure where you possibly could, but much of it did need to be replaced for digital television. Challenges of that really are to build your new infrastructure alongside your existing infrastructure, so that throughout there's continuity of service to the public, and they're not deprived of anything during the process. In terms of the viewing public, we've heard again this mentioned 2 or 3 times about the need not to leave people behind, and this was a great concern to many European broadcasters, that the transition to digital should be seen as a positive thing, and not in any way depriving people of TV. So many countries had what were referred to as help schemes, where there was specific attention to looking after the interests of elderly and vulnerable viewers. In some cases that included the provision of receiving equipment if the people would have difficulty affording that, and also providing people to go and support them in home in order to be able to train them to use the new equipment. Of course, the question there is how what technology do you choose for such a help scheme, and how much does it cost? DTT was frequently the cheapest option in a lot of cases, because it's the addition of a simple receiving box which plugs into somebody's aerial and their analog TV. But other platforms were also supported in a number of cases. So some countries would also support satellite. Some countries would actually even support IPTV during the transition. So post-DSO in Europe, terrestrial TV does remain the sort of platform of choice for the main set in many countries. It's also a key platform of providing service to second sets. So, for example, again, quick example in the UK, around about 40 to 45% of people use DTT on their main set. Something over 70% of people use DTT on another set somewhere else in the house. Cable and satellite are also very prominent in Europe, as I mentioned, typically where analog cable and satellite were previously very prominent. So the transition from analog to digital hasn't really made people move between platforms very much, but it has essentially meant the sort of continuity of each of those businesses in a fairly similar way. In terms of the cable and satellite, digital cable and satellite, certainly in the UK and other European countries, also carry, in addition to pay TV services and commercial services, they also carry the main public service channels as well. And that was seen as a very much important thing in terms of digital, was that you have, at the end of digital, you have one service that you go to. You go to DTT, or you go to digital cable, or you go to digital satellite, but you get the full suite of channels. Technology choices. Again, this was mentioned, I think, by both Ilham and Carleen. If you were into DTT early in Europe, then you chose DVB-T and you used MPEG-2 as your encoding standard, and that gave you SD video. Clearly, in the sort of mid to late 2000s, first of all, new encoding was introduced, so the H.264, which is equivalent to MPEG-4, they're the same thing. More impression and more efficient video encoding standard was introduced, which allowed you either to do more SD services, or you could make the choice to do HD services. Similarly, around that time, the DVB-T2 modulation scheme was introduced, which again gave you more capacity for your each UHF channel, and that gave the countries the choice to introduce one or other or both of those new technologies, and essentially each of those things has happened in some country or other. So some countries are still very much DVB-T based, but with H.264 and driving the additional capacity that way. Others have introduced partially or completely DVB-T2 technology, and now with the advent of HEVC as the latest video encoding, as I think was mentioned earlier, that's a realistic choice for anybody about to make a transition, or as a part of a restack, or as part of DSO. That's very much an option now as well. So I think what we have in Europe is a very, very diverse sort of ecosystem at the moment, all based around DVB and DVB-T and DVB-T2 as core technologies, but with very, very different sort of deployment models. So as I mentioned, just to conclude, terrestrial TV is now almost entirely digital. The aims that the regulators and broadcasters set out with which were to replicate analog, that's been very much achieved. There's a much increased choice of digital channels, and indeed spectrum has been released for use by the mobile industry, and returning in a lot of cases very significant revenue to the government from the auction of that spectrum. Digital broadcasting is inherently very flexible, and so many technology choices are available. You very much see that in Europe, that there is a great range of different styles of using the digital technology, and that evidently remains true now, so that whatever transition people are looking to do, then there is a set of technology choices that will enable you to meet the national situation. So that concludes everything that I wanted to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. That was a very brilliant presentation. Europe represents a variety of countries. He mentioned about 50, big and small, and he has taken us through the process pre-DSO, when they have very matured analog terrestrial systems, and today the process is virtually completed. He mentioned how UK and Sweden championed the beginning of the launch of the transition, and all the hurdles they went through. The Geneva Plan And I would say that Europe actually drove that plan, because I remember I was in Geneva during that conference, and it was a very interesting conference. There were two regions in Region 1 of the ITU, Africa and Europe. And Africa, unfortunately, did not come to the conference with any agreed date. The Europeans were very much organized. They got a mandate from the heads of state 2012. And the Africans would say, no, it's 2035. Ejida Manas was one of them. And there was now this kind of conflict between Europe and Africa. And at the end of the day, they all agreed for 2015. And Europe achieved. Africa is still trying to achieve. I'm sure at this conference we'll have some ideas for Africa to accelerate the process. Once again, thank you, Steve, for the wonderful presentation, and I think it deserves another round of applause.